April 20, 1945. Northern Germany. Dawn has not yet arrived. The air tastes of diesel and damp earth. A single man crouches beside the bullet-riddled fuselage of a German fighter plane, his breath forming small clouds in the frozen morning darkness. His hands shake, not from fear but from 16 months of starvation, solitary confinement, and a cold so deep it has settled into his bones like a permanent guest. Close up, his fingers trace the jagged holes punched through the metal skin of the Focke-Wulf FW-190. Each perforation tells a story of violence, of aerial combat, of survival and failure. The irony is not lost on him. This is the same type of aircraft that shot him from the sky 14 months ago, the same predator that turned him from hunter to prey in a single devastating burst of cannon fire. Behind him, two other men wait in the shadows. Jerome Ennis, gaunt and exhausted, and a Canadian airman they call George, whose full name will be lost to history. Ennis holds a .25 caliber pistol given to them by a French laborer, a woman forced from her home to work German soil. The weapon feels almost absurd in his trembling grip, a child's toy against the machinery of the Third Reich. Slow pan across the abandoned airfield. Scattered wreckage, damaged aircraft standing like tombstones in the pre-dawn gloom, the skeletal remains of Germany's once mighty Luftwaffe. Somewhere beyond the tree line, artillery rumbles, Soviet guns advancing from the east, American and British forces closing from the west. The Reich is collapsing, folding in on itself like a dying star. But none of that matters right now. What matters is the single decision facing Robert Anderson Hoover: climb into the cockpit of this enemy fighter, start an engine he has never operated, fly an aircraft he has never trained in, navigate without instruments or maps toward an Allied line he can only guess at, or wait for liberation that may never come, for Soviet forces who might mistake him for the enemy, for German guards who might execute every prisoner before surrender. Handheld POV. The cockpit looms above him, dark and foreign, marked with Luftwaffe insignia that means death to any Allied pilot who sees it in the sky. The control panels are labeled in German, the instruments calibrated in measurements he barely understands. The compass, he will later discover, is damaged and unreliable. He has no parachute. He has no identification that would save him if shot down over Allied territory. He is about to become, for all practical purposes, an enemy combatant flying toward the guns of his own side. Aerial drift. Camera pulls back slowly, revealing the three escapees as small figures dwarfed by the expanse of the airfield, by the weight of the impossible choice, by the machinery of war that has brought them to this frozen moment suspended between captivity and freedom, between life and certain death. A sound cuts through the silence, footsteps, boots on gravel. A German mechanic emerges from behind a damaged hangar, his face registering shock, then fear as he sees the three prisoners standing beside the FW-190. His mouth opens to shout, but Jerome Ennis is faster, pressing the small pistol against the man's ribs, speaking rapid French that the mechanic somehow understands, his voice carrying a desperation that transcends language. "Help him start the engine or you die here." The mechanic's eyes go wide. He looks at Hoover, at the damaged fighter, at the impossible situation unfolding in the gray light of dawn. For a moment, time itself seems to pause, waiting for his answer, waiting for the chain of events that will determine whether this morning ends in escape or execution, in freedom or in an unmarked grave on a forgotten German airfield. Close up, Hoover's face, hollow-cheeked from malnutrition, eyes sunken but burning with something that refuses to die. Determination, perhaps. Or madness. Or that peculiar species of courage that looks indistinguishable from suicide until it succeeds. The mechanic nods slowly. And in that single gesture, everything changes. But how did an American fighter pilot, a man who should be safe behind Allied lines or at worst waiting for liberation in a POW camp, find himself here, in this frozen moment, about to commit an act so audacious that even his fellow prisoners called it insane? How does a skilled aviator become a desperate fugitive stealing an enemy aircraft in the final weeks of the war? The answer lies 16 months in the past, in the clear blue sky above the Mediterranean Sea, where Robert Hoover's war took a turn he could never have imagined. Nashville, Tennessee. January 24, 1922. Robert Anderson Hoover is born into a world still healing from one world war, not yet knowing a second one waits just beyond the horizon. His childhood is ordinary in the way that ordinary American childhoods were in the 1920s and 30s, schoolwork, summer heat, the sound of his mother's voice calling him in for dinner. But there is something else, something that sets him apart even as a boy, an obsession with flight, with machines that defy gravity, with the impossible dream of leaving the earth behind. He is 15 years old when he takes his first flying lesson, paying for it with money saved from a grocery store job. The instructor is skeptical. The boy is too young, too eager, too hungry for the sky. But when Hoover climbs into the cockpit for the first time, something clicks, some innate understanding of the relationship between metal and air, between control surfaces and the three-dimensional freedom that most humans can only dream about. Tracking shot. A young Hoover at the controls of a small training aircraft, his face illuminated by pure joy, by the realization that he has found the thing he was born to do. His hands move with a certainty that surprises even his instructor. Banking, climbing, descending, each maneuver feels natural, instinctive, as if he had been flying in some previous life and is only now remembering how. By 16 he has his pilot's license. By 18 he is working as a mechanic and flight instructor, teaching others the craft that has become his entire world. But it is 1940 now and the world is burning. Europe is at war. England stands alone against the Nazi war machine. And America, still officially neutral, is building its military in preparation for the conflict everyone knows is coming. When the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Hoover is 19 years old and ready. He enlists immediately, joining the United States Army Air Forces with a single goal: to fly fighters in combat, to test his skills against the best pilots the enemy can field. The confidence of youth, perhaps. Or the naivete of someone who has never seen what high-velocity cannon shells do to human flesh, never watched a friend's aircraft disintegrate in a ball of fire, never felt the terror of being hunted by someone better, faster, more experienced. Over-the-shoulder view, Hoover in training, mastering aircraft after aircraft, the At-6 Texan trainer, the P-40 Warhawk, eventually the sleek and deadly P-51 Mustang, the fighter that will help win the air war over Europe. But his first combat assignment will not be in a Mustang. Instead, he is posted to Casablanca in North Africa, where his initial duty is not combat but flight testing, ensuring that aircraft assembled in theater are airworthy and ready for battle. It is tedious work, unglamorous, far from the heroic aerial battles he dreamed about as a boy. But it is essential, and it teaches him something crucial: intimate knowledge of aircraft systems, of how engines behave under stress, of what can go wrong at 10,000 feet and how to survive it. Skills that will, in time, save his life in ways he cannot yet imagine. Then comes the assignment he has been waiting for: the 52nd Fighter Group flying Supermarine Spitfires out of Sicily. The Spitfire, British-designed, elegant as a rapier, beloved by pilots on both sides of the conflict for its handling and performance. Hoover falls in love with the aircraft immediately, with its elliptical wings and Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, with the way it responds to the slightest touch like a living thing. He begins flying combat missions: fighter sweeps over occupied France and Italy, bomber escorts deep into enemy territory, ground attack missions against German supply lines. Each sortie takes him closer to the edge, each mission a roll of the dice against flak, against enemy fighters, against mechanical failure or simple bad luck. He is good, perhaps even exceptional, but this is total war, and being good is sometimes not enough. By early 1944, Hoover has flown 58 missions. He has seen friends die, watched aircraft spiral into the Mediterranean trailing smoke, heard the last radio transmissions of pilots who knew they would not make it home. He is 22 years old and has the eyes of someone much older, the particular weariness that comes from dancing with death on a daily basis. But there is something else in his eyes too: a competitive fire, a need to prove himself not just competent but exceptional, to push beyond the limits of what is considered safe or sane. His fellow pilots respect him, but they also worry about him, about the risks he takes, about the way he seems to be challenging fate itself, daring it to come for him. Fate, as it turns out, is paying attention. Does Hoover sense it, on the morning of February 9, 1944, as he walks toward his Spitfire Mark V for his 59th mission? Does some instinct whisper that this day will be different, that the dice are about to come up wrong? Or is he simply doing what fighter pilots do, climbing into the cockpit, running through pre-flight checks, pushing thoughts of mortality into a dark corner of his mind where they cannot interfere with the job at hand? February 9, 1944. Morning. The Mediterranean coast of southern France. The mission briefing is routine: a fighter sweep over enemy-held territory, hunting for German aircraft, looking for targets of opportunity. The weather is clear, visibility unlimited, the kind of day when air combat becomes a deadly game of physics and skill, where the pilot who sees first and shoots straight goes home, and the one who hesitates becomes a statistic. Hoover's Spitfire Mark V is having mechanical problems. Nothing catastrophic, but the engine is running rough, not developing full power. The sensible thing would be to abort, to let another pilot take his place, to wait for the mechanics to diagnose and fix whatever is wrong. But Hoover is not feeling sensible today. He has flown 58 missions. He is eager for number 59. The problems seem minor, manageable. First mistake. Close up. His hand on the throttle, pushing it forward, feeling the Merlin engine respond with less power than it should, a subtle wrongness in the vibration that travels through the airframe. He knows something is not right. He knows, and he makes the conscious decision to go anyway. The formation takes off, climbing through clear air toward the French coast. Below them, the Mediterranean stretches to the horizon, deceptively peaceful from altitude, its surface glittering in the morning sun. It does not look like a graveyard, but that is what it is. Hundreds of aircraft and their pilots rest on the seabed below, claimed by combat or mechanical failure or simple exhaustion. They cross the coastline, entering enemy airspace. Every pilot's awareness sharpens, scanning the sky in quadrants, looking for the telltale glint of sunlight on canopy or wing, the dark specks against clouds that might be enemy fighters. Radio chatter is minimal, clipped, professional. Each man knows his job. Each man knows the odds. Then the call, bandits 2 o'clock high. Aerial perspective. German fighters diving out of the sun, Focke-Wulf FW-190s, some of the deadliest aircraft in the Luftwaffe inventory. They are faster than Spitfires in a dive, more heavily armed, flown by veterans of the Eastern Front where pilots who make mistakes do not get second chances. The formation breaks, each pilot choosing an opponent, the sky suddenly filled with twisting, turning aircraft, with tracer fire stitching bright lines through the air, with the chatter of machine guns and the deeper boom of 20mm cannons. Hoover selects a target, but his Spitfire is sluggish, not responding with the crisp authority he needs. The mechanical problems he ignored on the ground are worse at altitude, under combat stress, with the engine screaming at emergency power. He is at a disadvantage, and somewhere in the chaos of the dogfight, a German pilot named Siegfried Lemke sees it. Lemke is good, a member of Jagerschwader II, a fighter wing with a distinguished combat record. He has survived years of war by being better than his opponents, by recognizing weakness and exploiting it without mercy. And Hoover's crippled Spitfire is weak, unable to turn as tightly or climb as quickly as the other Allied fighters. Tracking shot from Lemke's perspective. The damaged Spitfire trying to evade, banking hard, the pilot fighting his aircraft as much as he is fighting the enemy. Lemke lines up the shot, patient, professional, waiting for the perfect moment. A single 20mm cannon shell strikes Hoover's Spitfire at the wing root. In that microsecond, everything changes. The structural spar, the main beam that holds the wing to the fuselage, shatters under the impact and explosive force of the shell. The wing tears away from the aircraft completely, and the Spitfire instantly transforms from a graceful fighter into a tumbling coffin, spinning out of control with gravitational forces that slam Hoover against his harness with crushing violence. Handheld POV from Hoover's position. The world is rotating wildly, sky and sea and sky and sea, the centrifugal force trying to hold him in the cockpit even as he knows he has seconds at most to get out before the aircraft disintegrates completely or the fuel tanks explode. He pulls himself out. The exact mechanics are lost in the blur of adrenaline and survival instinct, but somehow, through strength or luck or sheer desperation, he extracts himself from the spinning wreckage and pulls his ripcord. The parachute deploys. The violent tumble stops, replaced by the gentle descent under canopy, the sudden silence after the roar of combat, the strange peace that comes after accepting death and then finding yourself somehow still alive. Below him, the Mediterranean is approaching, its surface no longer beautiful but cold and vast and indifferent. The other aircraft are gone, the dogfight moving away at 300 miles per hour, leaving him alone in the sky with his damaged parachute and whatever prayers men say when they realize survival is no longer in their hands. He hits the water hard. The cold is shocking, driving the air from his lungs, the parachute threatening to drag him under as it fills with water. He struggles free of the harness, strips off his heavy flight gear, begins treading water, trying to conserve energy, trying not to think about how long a man can survive in the Mediterranean in February, how long before hypothermia or exhaustion claims him. 4 hours. That is how long he will tread water, becoming progressively weaker, colder, closer to simply letting go and sinking into the blue depths. 4 hours of solitude and regret, of replaying the decision to fly a malfunctioning aircraft, of thinking about Nashville and family and all the things he will never get to say or do. Then, on the horizon, a shape. A boat. For a moment, hope surges. Rescue, survival, another chance. Then, as the vessel draws closer, he sees the markings, the flag, the uniforms of the crew hauling him aboard. German. A patrol boat, Kriegsmarine, pulling him from the sea not as a comrade but as an enemy, as a prisoner of war, as property of the Third Reich. Over-the-shoulder view. Hoover lying on the deck, water streaming from his clothes, surrounded by German sailors who regard him with a mix of curiosity and professional detachment. He is alive, but alive in a way he never imagined. His war transformed from the aerial combat he trained for into something far more grinding and uncertain: captivity, interrogation, an indefinite future behind barbed wire, waiting for a war's end that might never come. One of the German sailors tosses him a rough blanket. The gesture is neither kind nor cruel, simply practical, keeping a prisoner alive for interrogation. Hoover wraps himself in it, shivering uncontrollably, his mind already beginning to grasp the enormity of what has just happened, of how quickly a combat pilot's life can pivot from hunter to hunted, from free to imprisoned. As the patrol boat turns toward the coast, carrying him toward an uncertain fate, one question burns in his mind: how does a man trained to fly and fight survive in a world reduced to a prison cell, to guard towers and barbed wire, to the slow psychological death of captivity? He is about to find out. Stalag Luft I, Barth, Northern Germany. Spring 1944. The camp rises from flat, wind-swept terrain like a scar on the landscape, wooden barracks standing on foundation posts 8 to 10 inches off the ground, surrounded by multiple fences of barbed wire, overlooked by guard towers where men with machine guns watch for any hint of escape. It is a place designed to contain Allied airmen, officers primarily, pilots and navigators and bombardiers who have been shot down and survived, who now wait in limbo for the war to end one way or another. This is where Robert Hoover will spend the next 16 months of his life. The barracks are crude structures, wood-frame buildings that do little to keep out the harsh northern German weather. Each building contains triple-tiered bunks with mattresses stuffed with wood chips. Not comfort exactly, but better than sleeping on bare boards. A communal day room offers minimal equipment and inadequate lighting that must be dimmed or extinguished by 9 p.m., with shutters closed until 6 a.m., creating ventilation so poor that respiratory disease becomes a constant threat. Close up, Hoover on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, counting the days, counting the ways he might escape. Because that is what fighter pilots do when caged. They plan, they scheme, they refuse to accept captivity as their final fate. The conditions at Stalag Luft I are initially tolerable, if not comfortable. International Red Cross parcels provide food to supplement meager German rations. Prisoners organize themselves, establish routines, create makeshift schools and entertainment to fight the psychological erosion of indefinite confinement. The German guards, while not friendly, adhere mostly to the Geneva Conventions governing the treatment of prisoners of war. But Hoover cannot simply wait. His nature rebels against passivity, against accepting bars and guards and the slow passage of time while the war continues without him. He joins the camp's escape committee, a group of more than 200 men dedicated to finding ways out of Stalag Luft I, to returning to the fight, to refusing the psychological defeat that long-term imprisonment represents. Over-the-shoulder view, secret meetings in barracks, men speaking in low voices about tunnels and forged documents and guard schedules, about the careful accumulation of intelligence that might mean the difference between freedom and a bullet from a guard tower. Hoover absorbs it all, contributes what he can, makes attempt after attempt to escape. Each attempt fails. Each failure results in punishment: solitary confinement in a cell too small to lie down in, reduced rations, psychological pressure designed to break the will to resist. Most men would quit after 1 or 2 attempts, accepting that escape from Stalag Luft I is effectively impossible. Hoover does not quit. His repeated escape attempts earn him a reputation among both prisoners and guards: troublemaker, someone to watch, someone who cannot be trusted to accept his circumstances. The solitary confinement becomes longer, harsher, designed to break him. It does not work. Tracking shot through the camp. Prisoners moving between barracks, some maintaining hope, others sliding into the defeated posture of men who have accepted indefinite captivity. Hoover remains in the first category, his eyes still burning with that peculiar intensity, his mind still calculating angles and opportunities, still planning the escape that everyone says is impossible. Then in April 1944, something shifts in the camp's atmosphere. New orders arrive from German High Command regarding air raids. All personnel must remain inside when immediate warning sirens sound. The German guards become more severe, their treatment of prisoners harsher, as if some directive from above has changed the calculus of how Allied airmen should be handled. The German attitude is deteriorating and everyone in the camp can feel it. The guards are nervous, jumpy, responding to pressures from outside that the prisoners can only guess at. The Eastern Front is collapsing. Allied bombers are reducing German cities to rubble. The end is coming, but no one knows how that end will affect the men trapped in prisoner-of-war camps across Germany. Late in 1944, after the Allied invasion of Normandy, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower issues an extraordinary order. Allied prisoners of war should stop attempting to escape. Liberation is imminent, he reasons. Better to wait safely behind barbed wire than to risk being shot during escape attempts when freedom is just weeks or months away. Close up, Hoover receiving this news, his face unreadable. Other prisoners accept it with relief, permission to stop risking their lives, official sanction to wait for the end they can all sense approaching. But Hoover and the Escape Committee see something else entirely. They see the Soviet Red Army advancing from the east, its behavior toward prisoners unpredictable and often brutal. They see German guards who might decide to execute all prisoners before the camp is overrun, eliminating witnesses to any violations of international law. They see the possibility that liberation might come in the form of Soviet occupation, which could be as bad or worse than German captivity. And perhaps most importantly, they see men who have spent years planning escapes, who have maintained their sanity through hope and action, who cannot simply turn off that drive because someone thousands of miles away thinks it is safer to wait. By early 1945, conditions in the camp are deteriorating rapidly. From March 3rd to the end of the month, no Red Cross parcels are distributed. German rations decline to the point where men become so weak they fall down trying to get from their bunks. American MPs are stationed around garbage cans to prevent starving prisoners from eating refuse that might make them sick. Handheld POV, the interior of a barracks, men lying listlessly on bunks, the smell of unwashed bodies and sickness, the sound of coughing and low conversations, the gradual erosion of hope that comes from starvation and uncertainty. Hoover, despite repeated punishments and solitary confinement, is still plotting, still gathering intelligence, still refusing to accept that his war will end in a POW camp, waiting passively for whatever fate the collapsing Reich has in store for its captives. In late April 1945, the moment he has been waiting for finally arrives, not through careful planning or intelligence gathering, but through chaos, through the violent disorder that sometimes creates opportunity where order creates only walls. What happens when desperation meets opportunity, when a year of planning collides with a single night of riots and confusion? What does freedom look like when it is stolen rather than given? April 20, 1945. Stalag Luft I. After dark. The tension in the camp has been building for weeks like pressure behind a dam. Starvation, rumors of massacres at other camps, the sound of Soviet artillery growing louder each day, everything is pushing toward some kind of breaking point. The German guards are increasingly erratic, torn between duty and the survival instinct that tells them to abandon their posts before the Red Army arrives. Then, on this particular night, something breaks. It starts with an argument, a scuffle between prisoners over food or insult or simply the accumulated stress of captivity. Within minutes, it escalates into something larger, a full-scale riot involving several thousand inmates, the largest disturbance Stalag Luft I has seen. Men who have been passive for months suddenly explode into violence and chaos, releasing anger and fear in a wave that overwhelms the guards' ability to maintain order. Aerial view. The entire compound erupting, guards rushing toward one side where the worst fighting is concentrated, searchlights sweeping across the chaos, the normal disciplined response to escape attempts completely breaking down in the face of mass disorder. This is the moment the Escape Committee has been working toward, not the riot itself but the opportunity it creates. Guards distracted, procedures disrupted, the machine of control temporarily malfunctioning. Close up, Hoover's face as he receives the signal. This is it. After 16 months of captivity, after repeated failed attempts, after solitary confinement and punishment and the slow erosion of hope, the door is finally cracking open. He moves quickly to link up with two other prisoners. Second Lieutenant Jerome Jerry Ennis, a fellow Spitfire pilot from the 4th Fighter Squadron shot down in December 1943, and a Canadian airman named George whose full identity will vanish into the gaps of history. They have been planning this for weeks, waiting for precisely this kind of chaos, this kind of opportunity. The plan is simple in concept, nearly impossible in execution. During the riot, while guards are focused on the mass disturbance on the eastern side of the camp, run to the western fence with a wooden plank hidden beneath one of the barracks, place it across the barbed wire, climb over before the guards realize what is happening. Tracking shot. The three men crawling beneath a barracks building, retrieving the plank they have concealed there, a rough board perhaps 12 feet long, heavy and awkward but their only tool against multiple strands of barbed wire designed to shred anyone who tries to climb over. The riot reaches its peak, shouting, fighting, the thud of fists and bodies, guards blowing whistles and firing warning shots into the air. In the confusion and darkness, with searchlights sweeping toward the main disturbance, Hoover, Ennis and George make their run. Handheld POV, racing across open ground with the plank, every second expecting the crack of rifle fire, the searchlight swinging toward them, the shout of discovery. But the guards are overwhelmed, focused on the thousands of prisoners creating chaos on the other side of the compound. They reach the fence. The plank goes up and over the barbed wire, its weight pressing down the top strands just enough to create a narrow bridge. One by one, carefully, hearts pounding, they walk across it, balancing on rough wood with freedom on one side and 16 months of captivity on the other. First George crosses, then Ennis, finally Hoover. They jump down the other side into darkness, into enemy territory, into a Germany that is collapsing but still lethal to escaped prisoners. For a moment they stand there, outside the fence for the first time in over a year, breathing free air, unable to quite believe they have actually done it. Then training and survival instinct kick in. They run. Over the shoulder view, 3 figures disappearing into the trees beyond the camp perimeter, the searchlights still focused on the riot behind them, the camp's alarms not yet sounding for their absence. They have minutes, perhaps an hour at most, before the escape is discovered and pursuit begins. They follow a dirt road through the darkness, moving fast despite their weakened condition, knowing that every step away from Stalag Luft I is a step closer to possible freedom or possible death. There is no middle ground now, no safety in waiting, only the desperate gamble they have chosen. After several miles they come upon a farmhouse, dark and quiet in the pre-dawn hours. They debate, knock on the door and risk being turned in, or move on and risk dying from exhaustion and starvation. The decision is made for them when a light appears in the window. They have been seen. A woman emerges, alone, studying the 3 gaunt men in ragged clothes who have appeared at her door in the middle of the night. For a long moment, no one speaks. This could go either way. She could scream for help, alert German authorities, ensure their recapture. Instead, incredibly, she invites them inside. Close up, her face, worn and tired, not German by accent but French, one of the thousands of foreign laborers forced to work German farms after their countries were occupied. She has no love for the Reich, no loyalty to the system that has enslaved her. These starving men at her door are enemies of her enemy, and that is enough. She makes them food, simple, hot, the first real meal they have had in weeks. She does not ask questions, does not demand explanations. She simply feeds them, hides them in her barn, gives them a few hours of rest before they must move on. When they leave at dawn, Hoover writes her a brief note, a request to any Allied soldiers who find her to treat her kindly, a small attempt at repayment for an act of compassion that may have saved their lives. They find bicycles, probably abandoned or hidden by other forced laborers. Riding is difficult after months of near starvation and minimal exercise, but it is faster than walking, carries them farther from the camp before pursuit can organize. Several miles down the road, as the sun rises higher, George makes a decision. He will take his chances alone, separate from the other 2, increase his odds through solitude rather than cooperation. Hoover and Ennis try to convince him otherwise, but George's mind is made up. They part ways at a crossroads, and George simply disappears from the historical record. His fate unknown, his survival or death one of the thousands of small mysteries that wars create and never answer. Now there are 2, Hoover and Ennis, cycling through the German countryside, searching for something neither quite dares to hope for, an opportunity not just to escape the camp but to escape Germany entirely, to return to Allied lines, to finish the war they were pulled from 16 months ago. What they find instead is something impossible, something audacious, something that will either deliver them to freedom or ensure their deaths in the most spectacular way imaginable. April 20th, 1945. Mid-morning. Somewhere in northern Germany. The airfield appears through morning mist like a ghost of the Luftwaffe's former power. Hoover and Ennis see it from the road, damaged aircraft scattered across the field, the wreckage of Germany's air war slowly rusting in the spring rain. They stop, concealing themselves in a line of trees, studying the scene with professional interest. Both men are trained pilots, fighter pilots, their minds automatically assessing what they see through the lens of aviation. Slow pan across the airfield. Messerschmitt fighters with collapsed landing gear, Junkers bombers with engines missing, Focke-Wulf FW-190s bearing the scars of aerial combat, bullet holes, patch damage, the wear and tear of a losing war. The airfield appears abandoned or nearly so, lightly guarded at most, another casualty of Germany's collapsing military infrastructure. Close up, Hoover's eyes, narrowing with calculation. An idea is forming, so audacious that even thinking it seems insane. But insanity and brilliance often occupy the same territory, especially in war. Can you fly a German fighter? Ennis asks, reading Hoover's expression. Hoover considers the question. He has never flown a German aircraft, never even sat in one except as a curiosity examining captured examples. The controls are in German, the systems unfamiliar, the flight characteristics different from the Spitfires and Mustangs he has trained in. And even if he could fly one, even if he could start the engine and take off without killing himself, he would then have to navigate without maps or instruments toward Allied lines. He can only guess at flying an aircraft that every Allied fighter pilot is trained to shoot down on sight. Probably, he says, which is both honest and completely inadequate to describe the risks involved. They wait until late afternoon, watching the airfield, counting the few personnel they can see, mapping guard patterns and routines. The field is not completely abandoned. There are still German troops present, still someone maintaining a minimal level of security, but it is far from the heavily defended Luftwaffe bases of earlier war years. As dusk approaches, they make their move, walking onto the airfield with a confidence born of desperation, as if they belong there, as if they are authorized to be examining these damaged aircraft. Tracking shot. Hoover moving from plane to plane, conducting quick assessments with a pilot's eye. This one has engine damage. No good. That one is missing flight control surfaces. No good. Another has visible structural damage that would make flight suicidal even if the engine started. Then he finds it, a Focke-Wulf FW-190, riddled with bullet holes but structurally intact, sitting alone near the edge of the field. The aircraft that shot him down 16 months ago, the Predator that ended his first war and began his second one behind barbed wire. The irony is so thick he can almost taste it. Handheld POV, Hoover climbing onto the wing, peering into the cockpit. The canopy is open, the controls visible, everything labeled in German. Hohenmesser for altimeter, Fahrtmesser for airspeed indicator, systems and switches he will have to figure out in real time if he is going to make this insanity work. He checks the fuel gauge full. Either the aircraft was recently serviced or has been sitting here and used as the Reich conserves fuel for more critical operations. Either way, it is a piece of luck almost too good to believe. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 is one of the Luftwaffe's premier fighters. Powered by a BMW radial engine producing 1,776 horsepower, capable of speeds up to 426 miles per hour, armed with two 13mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons. It is faster than a Spitfire in level flight, better in a dive, a deadly opponent in the hands of a skilled pilot. The Germans have used them to devastating effect on both the eastern and western fronts. And Hoover, weakened from 16 months of captivity, is about to attempt to steal one and fly it to freedom without maps, without a working compass, without even a parachute. Over-the-shoulder view, Ennis standing guard, every nerve on edge, scanning for German personnel, for the discovery that will end this mad plan before it even begins. Then footsteps. A German mechanic rounds the corner of a damaged hangar, freezing when he sees the two prisoners examining the FW-190. For a microsecond, everyone is paralyzed, the tableau frozen in the fading light. Escape artist, accomplice, and the witness who can end everything with a single shout. Ennis moves first, pulling the .25 caliber pistol from his pocket, pressing it against the mechanic's ribs with enough force to make the threat clear. The weapon is small, almost comically inadequate against the military infrastructure of the Third Reich, but at point-blank range it is more than sufficient. Hoover steps forward, speaking in slow English, gesturing toward the aircraft. Ennis speaks French, which the mechanic apparently understands, translating Hoover's instructions. Help start the engine or die here. Close up. The mechanic's face, calculating odds, weighing loyalty to a collapsing regime against the immediate threat of death. The calculation takes perhaps 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds contain the entire weight of the war's end. Germany is losing, everyone knows it, dying for a lost cause is harder to justify than simply surviving to see tomorrow. He nods. What follows is a strange collaboration between captor and captive, a technical ballet performed under duress. The mechanic shows Hoover how to prime the engine, which switches control fuel flow, how to engage the starter. Hoover climbs into the cockpit, trying to memorize the layout in the few minutes he has, his hands finding throttle and stick by feel and instinct, his pilot's training translating foreign instruments into universal concepts of lift and thrust and control. The BMW engine coughs, then catches, the propeller spinning up with a throaty roar that sounds impossibly loud in the quiet evening air. Tracking shot. Lights coming on in buildings across the airfield, figures emerging, shouts in German, the alarm being raised as personnel realize something is very wrong. No time for a proper run-up, no time for pre-flight checks. Hoover looks at Ennis, the two men understanding instantly that the plan has changed. The aircraft has room for only one occupant, no space for a second passenger. The decision is made without words. Hoover will fly out. Ennis will stay holding the gun, creating confusion, increasing the chances that at least one of them reaches Allied lines. Go! Ennis shouts over the engine roar. Hoover does not taxi toward the runway. There is no time, no opportunity for a conventional takeoff. Instead, he slams the throttle forward, releasing the brakes, pointing the nose straight across the field toward open ground, betting everything on raw power and accumulated airspeed. Handheld POV from the cockpit. The field racing past, gaining speed, the boundary fence approaching fast, German personnel running toward the aircraft, some raising weapons. Hoover pulls back on the stick. The FW-190 leaps into the air, clearing the fence with meters to spare, climbing into the darkening sky with full throttle and a prayer, escaping the ground in the most literal and desperate sense. Behind him, the airfield erupts into chaos. Ahead of him lies enemy territory, Allied lines somewhere to the west, and freedom or death measured in fuel capacity and navigation luck. But what will happen when he reaches Allied airspace flying a German fighter with Luftwaffe markings? Will he be shot down by his own side, killed by pilots who cannot know an American is at the controls? April 20, 1945. Evening. The sky over northern Germany. Hoover climbs to altitude, feeling the Focke-Wulf respond to his inputs with characteristics completely different from the Spitfires he has flown. The FW-190 is heavier, more powerful, less forgiving of mistakes. The controls are positioned differently, the instrument panel a puzzle of German labels and unfamiliar gauges. He levels off, trying to establish a heading westward, toward where he believes the Allied lines should be. The compass is functioning, but something about its behavior seems off, possibly damaged in combat or simply uncalibrated, giving readings he cannot fully trust. Close up, Hoover's face in the cockpit, illuminated by instrument lights, every muscle tense with concentration. He is flying by instinct and training, translating the foreign aircraft into familiar concepts through sheer force of will and years of experience. Below him, the German landscape is darkening into twilight. Villages and towns show few lights, blackout conditions still in effect despite the obvious approach of defeat. Rivers gleam like silver threads in the last light, roads form dark lines across fields and forests, but without a map, without definitive landmarks, navigation becomes guesswork refined by professional skill. The fuel gauge shows full, which gives him perhaps 300 miles of range if he manages the throttle carefully. 300 miles that must carry him from deep inside Germany to Allied-controlled territory in the Netherlands or Belgium. 300 miles in an enemy fighter that any Allied pilot will attack on sight. He considers the options, none of them good. He has no parachute. If he is shot down or suffers mechanical failure, he will ride the aircraft into the ground. He has no radio code that would identify him as friendly, no way to communicate his situation to Allied forces. Even if he successfully reaches Allied airspace, landing while still in an aircraft marked with Luftwaffe insignia is almost suicidal. Trigger-happy ground forces or patrolling fighters could kill him before he has a chance to surrender. But the alternative is to turn back, to land in Germany and face certain recapture or execution, to surrender the freedom he has just risked everything to achieve. Not an option. He flies on, westward, as darkness deepens and the stars emerge. Aerial perspective. A single German fighter crossing the landscape, alone, unescorted, heading in a direction that suggests not attack but escape. A tiny speck of metal and courage against the vast darkness of occupied Europe in its final weeks of war. The minutes stretch into an hour, then longer. Hoover monitors the fuel gauge, watching it creep downward, calculating range versus distance, speed versus endurance. He is flying too slow for optimal fuel economy but cannot risk going faster and overshooting Allied lines into a crash in German territory. Below, the landscape begins to change subtly. More damaged infrastructure, more signs of recent combat, burned-out vehicles and cratered fields suggesting the passage of armies, the grinding contact between German forces and Allied advance. Then, ahead, a sight that brings simultaneous relief and terror. Windmills, the distinctive silhouettes of Dutch windmills against the darkening sky. The Netherlands, liberated territory, Allied control. He has made it. But now comes the most dangerous part of the entire escape. Landing. Tracking shot. The FW-190 beginning its descent, Hoover scanning for a suitable field, somewhere flat and long enough to accommodate a fighter landing, preferably away from populated areas where anti-aircraft guns might be positioned. He spots an open field, agricultural land recently plowed or harvested, flat and clear of obstacles. Not a runway, but it will have to do. Hoover extends the landing gear, feeling the drag increase, the aircraft slowing. He lines up on the field, managing his approach speed by instinct, no time to consult instruments, everything happening through muscle memory and training. Handheld POV from the cockpit. The ground approaching, the field resolving into individual details. Furrows, a ditch along one edge, the trees marking the boundary. He is coming in fast, faster than ideal, but he has no choice. Better to land hot than stall and crash. The wheels touch down, the FW-190 bouncing slightly, the tail settling. Hoover applies brakes, feeling the aircraft slow, eating up the available field length. Then he sees it, a ditch ahead, directly in his path, too close to avoid. Split-second calculation. If he hits the ditch with the landing gear extended, the aircraft will nose over, trap him upside down in a German fighter where Allied soldiers might shoot first and check the pilot's nationality later. Close up. Hoover's hand reaching for the gear retraction lever, pulling it. The landing gear retracts. The FW-190 drops onto its belly, the friction dramatically increasing, the aircraft grinding to a stop just meters short of the ditch, sliding to a halt in a cloud of dirt and torn metal. For a moment, Hoover sits in the cockpit, engine ticking as it cools, strikes the ground, the smell of fuel and hot metal. He has made it. Against odds that seemed impossible, flying an enemy aircraft with no maps and a damaged compass, he has escaped German territory and landed in Allied-controlled Holland. But survival is not yet certain. He is still sitting in a German fighter, still marked with Luftwaffe insignia, still indistinguishable from an enemy pilot to anyone approaching the crashed aircraft. He pops the canopy open, raising his hands immediately, shouting in English, "American! American pilot! Don't shoot!" Figures emerge from the tree line. Dutch civilians, then Allied soldiers, weapons raised, approaching cautiously. They see the German aircraft, see a pilot climbing out, and their fingers tighten on triggers. "I'm American." Hoover shouts again, desperation giving his voice volume and clarity. Shot down 16 months ago. Escaped from Stalag Luft I. The soldiers approach, still wary, weapons trained on him. One of them, an officer, demands identification, proof, some evidence that this pilot climbing out of a German fighter is who he claims to be. Hoover has no dog tags, they were taken when he was captured. No identification papers, no uniform except the ragged clothes he escaped in. All he has is his story, his American accent, and the desperate hope that these men will believe him before they shoot. Close up, the officer's face, skeptical but listening, weighing the impossible story against the evidence. The crashed German fighter, the gaunt man with hollow cheeks and the telltale signs of long captivity, the sheer audacity of the claim itself. Minutes pass that feel like hours. Questions are asked, answers given, details checked against what the soldiers know about POW camps and German aircraft and the hundreds of escape stories that have filtered through Allied lines in these final weeks of war. Finally, the officer lowers his weapon. "You're either the bravest pilot I've ever met or the craziest," he says. "Probably both," Hoover replies, and for the first time in 16 months, he allows himself to believe he might actually survive this war. Allied Field Headquarters, Netherlands. April 21, 1945. Hoover sits in a tent drinking real coffee for the first time in over a year, answering questions from intelligence officers who want every detail about Stalag Luft I, guard positions, prisoner numbers, conditions, anything that might help plan liberation or rescue operations. But his mind keeps returning to two men, Jerome Ennis and George, left behind when he flew the FW-190 to freedom. The intelligence officers make inquiries, send radio messages, check with advancing units. What they discover is both relieving and heartbreaking. Jerome Ennis was recaptured shortly after Hoover's takeoff. The chaos at the airfield, the stolen fighter, it had drawn every German soldier in the area. Ennis, holding a tiny .25 caliber pistol against an entire military infrastructure, never had a real chance. He was taken back to Stalag Luft I, placed in solitary confinement as punishment for the escape attempt. But here is where the story takes its unexpected turn. On May 1, 1945, just 11 days after the escape attempt, Soviet forces liberated Stalag Luft I. The German guards had already begun abandoning their posts, fleeing west toward American and British lines rather than face the Red Army. The prisoners, nearly 9,000 Allied airmen, were freed without a single shot fired. Jerome Ennis walked out of the camp a free man, his recapture having lasted barely a week before liberation rendered it meaningless. He survived the war, returned home, and the two pilots, Hoover and Ennis, remained friends for decades afterward, bound by the shared insanity of that April night when they tried the impossible. George, the Canadian airman who separated from the group to take his chances alone, simply vanished into history. No record of his recapture exists. No record of his survival or death was ever confirmed. He became one of the thousands of men whose final moments went unrecorded, uncelebrated, lost in the chaos of war's end. But here is the devastating twist that Hoover would spend the rest of his life contemplating. Tracking shot through Stalag Luft I on May 1, 1945. Prisoners streaming out of barracks into freedom, Soviet soldiers entering the camp, German guards gone or surrendered, the machinery of captivity simply stopping as if someone had thrown a switch. If Hoover had waited, if he had followed General Eisenhower's order to cease escape attempts, if he had simply remained in his bunk for 11 more days, he would have been liberated safely without risking his life or stealing an enemy aircraft or navigating across hostile territory in a damaged fighter. Close up. Hoover's face as this realization settles in, the understanding that his desperate escape, his incredible feat of aerial daring, his near-suicidal gamble, all of it had been, in some sense, unnecessary. Liberation was coming just as Eisenhower had predicted. He could have waited. But could he? Over-the-shoulder view, intelligence officers watching Hoover, seeing the complex emotions playing across his face, relief at survival, guilt about the men left behind, the strange hollowness that comes from achieving something extraordinary only to discover it might have been avoidable. You couldn't have known, one of the officers says gently, reading his expression. The Soviets might have killed prisoners instead of liberating them. The German guards might have executed everyone before fleeing. You made the best decision you could with the information you had. Hoover nods, but the words bring little comfort. He is a man who has just learned that the impossible thing he accomplished, stealing a Nazi fighter to escape a POW camp, might have been, from one perspective, completely unnecessary. Yet from another perspective, the escape defines something essential about who he was, about what it means to refuse captivity even when waiting might be safer, about the human need for agency and action even in the face of overwhelming odds. And perhaps that is the real story. Not whether the escape was necessary in hindsight, but what it revealed about the man who attempted it, about the kind of person who would rather risk death than accept waiting passively for a liberation that might never come. Aerial perspective. The Dutch field where the FW-190 lies belly down in the dirt, Allied soldiers already examining it, taking photographs, measuring the bullet holes in its wings and fuselage, documenting this strange artifact of war's end. A German fighter stolen by an American pilot, flown to freedom across enemy territory, landed without maps or instruments in a desperate bid for liberty. It will become, in time, one of the most famous escape stories of World War II, repeated in books and documentaries and air shows where Hoover will eventually perform, a legend of courage and skill that inspires pilots for generations. But for now, in this tent in liberated Holland, drinking coffee and answering questions, Robert Hoover is simply a survivor, a man who gambled everything on an impossible escape and somehow, against all odds, won. What will he do with the life he has reclaimed? How does a man who has flown into the jaws of death multiple times return to a normal existence? Wright Field, Ohio. 1946. The war is over. Germany has surrendered, Japan has surrendered, millions of soldiers and airmen are returning home to rebuild lives interrupted by combat. Most want nothing more than to forget the war, to settle into peacetime routines, to never again face the terror and violence that defined their youth. Robert Hoover is not most men. Within months of his escape and liberation, he is back in a cockpit, assigned to the Flight Evaluation Group at Wright Field, where his job is to test captured enemy aircraft and the latest American fighters emerging from wartime development. The very aircraft that tried to kill him, German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, Japanese Zeros and bombers, he now flies as a test pilot, evaluating their capabilities, documenting their strengths and weaknesses. Close up, Hoover at the controls of a captured FW-190, the same type of aircraft he stole to escape, now painted with American markings and subjected to rigorous testing. There is a poetry to this, a closing of a circle that began when Siegfried Lemke shot him down off the coast of France. In 1947 he receives an assignment that will define the rest of his life. Backup pilot for Chuck Yeager's attempt to break the sound barrier in the Bell X-1 rocket plane. Hoover flies chase in a Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star on October 14, 1947, when Yeager becomes the first human to fly faster than sound. Tracking shot. Two aircraft climbing into clear desert sky over California, the Orange X-1 with its rocket engine burning, and the P-80 chase plane with Hoover at the controls, escorting his friend into history. They are opposites in temperament, Yeager brash and competitive, Hoover quieter and more technical. but united by a shared understanding of what it means to push beyond limits, to test the edges of possible, to risk everything for the advancement of flight. After his military service ends in 1948, Hoover transitions to civilian test flying, working for Allison Engine Company and then North American Aviation. He tests the FJ-2 Fury, the F-86 Sabre jet, the F-100 Super Sabre, each one faster and more dangerous than the last, each one pushing him and the aircraft toward the boundaries of performance and survival. In the early 1950s, during the Korean War, he travels to Korea to demonstrate new dive-bombing techniques to combat pilots flying the F-86 Sabre. Not content to simply demonstrate, he flies actual combat missions over enemy territory, putting himself back into the war despite having no official requirement to do so. Over-the-shoulder view, Hoover diving toward a target in North Korea, the ground rushing up, the calculations of angle and speed and release point happening in microseconds, the same intensity and precision that allowed him to land the stolen FW-190 in a Dutch field 7 years earlier. But it is in air shows that Hoover truly finds his calling, his purpose beyond survival and war. Starting in the 1950s and continuing for nearly 50 years, he performs aerobatic demonstrations that redefine what audiences believe is possible with an aircraft. His signature routine, flying a P-51 Mustang through a series of impossible maneuvers, rolls, loops, inverted flight, all while pouring a glass of iced tea from a pitcher, the liquid never spilling, demonstrating his absolute control and the smoothness of his flying. Aerial perspective, a P-51 rolling inverted, the crowd gasping, Hoover in the cockpit calmly pouring tea, the aircraft responding to his touch with the precision of a surgeon's hand, 50 years of flying distilled into pure artistry. He becomes known as the pilot's pilot, respected even among professionals who fly for a living, a legend in aviation circles as someone who has mastered the craft at a level few will ever achieve. But there is something else driving him, something beneath the skill and artistry and death-defying stunts. Perhaps it is the memory of 16 months in captivity, of feeling helpless and caged, of watching life pass while trapped behind wire. Perhaps flying, aggressive, joyful, precise flying, is his answer to that captivity, his way of claiming freedom so completely that no one can ever take it from him again. Close up, Hoover's face during a performance, decades older now but still showing that same intensity, that same refusal to accept limits, that same fire that made him steal a German fighter rather than wait for liberation. Oshkosh, Wisconsin. 1980s. The Experimental Aircraft Association Air Venture. Every year, hundreds of thousands of aviation enthusiasts gather at this event, the largest air show in the world, to celebrate flying in all its forms. And every year, one performance draws the largest crowds, generates the most anticipation, receives the loudest applause. Bob Hoover's routine. Tracking shot across the crowd, faces turned skyward, children on parents' shoulders, veteran pilots who have flown combat missions standing with mouths open, everyone united in watching something that defies easy description. Not just skill but art, not just flying but a conversation between pilot and machine conducted at 300 miles per hour. Hoover is in his 60s now, an age when most pilots have long since retired, but his hands are as steady as they were at 22, his judgment as precise, his willingness to push boundaries undiminished by decades. He performs his famous energy management routine, shutting down both engines of his Shrike Commander twin-engine aircraft at altitude, then executing a complete aerobatic sequence, loops, rolls, figure eights, all without power, purely on potential energy converted to kinetic, calculating every maneuver to end in a perfect landing back on the runway where he started. Handheld POV from the aircraft. The engines silent, only wind noise and the movement of control surfaces, the ground approaching. During the final approach, speed bleeding off precisely, touchdown smooth and centered, rolling to a stop in front of the crowd with both propellers still. It is show business, yes, but it is also something more profound, a demonstration that flying is not just about engines and thrust, but about understanding physics and motion and the invisible relationships between airspeed and altitude, between potential and kinetic energy, between planning and execution. Over-the-shoulder view, the crowd erupting in applause, pilots who know exactly how difficult what they just witnessed was, standing and cheering for a man who has made the impossible look routine. But the performances are not just about ego or entertainment. Hoover uses these demonstrations to teach, to share decades of knowledge with younger pilots, to emphasize safety and precision and the importance of understanding aircraft systems and limitations. Between air shows, he visits military bases and flying schools, offering instruction, sharing stories, becoming a living link between World War II aviation and the modern era. Young fighter pilots listen with rapt attention as he describes dogfights over Europe, test flights in experimental jets, the time he stole a German fighter and flew it to freedom across enemy territory. That story, the Stalag Luft I escape, has become central to his legend, repeated in magazines and television interviews and books, each telling emphasizing different aspects. The courage, the desperation, the technical skill required to fly an unfamiliar aircraft without instruments or maps. Close up, an elderly Hoover being interviewed, his voice still strong, his memory sharp, recounting details of that April night in 1945 as if it happened yesterday rather than decades ago. The interviewer asks if he was afraid, if he thought he would die during the escape. Hoover considers the question carefully. "Fear is healthy," he says finally. "It keeps you sharp, makes you check and double-check, prevents you from making stupid mistakes. But it can't control you. The moment you let fear make your decisions is the moment you're defeated, whether you're in combat or captivity or simply trying to push the boundaries of what an aircraft can do. It is a philosophy forged in war, refined through decades of test flying and air shows, proven repeatedly in situations where others would have quit or failed." By the 1990s, Hoover has received nearly every aviation award imaginable: the Distinguished Flying Cross for his combat service, the Wright Brothers Memorial Trophy for contributions to aviation, induction into the National Aviation Hall of Fame, countless others recognizing his achievements as pilot, test pilot, and aviation ambassador. But perhaps the greatest honor is simpler and more profound: the nickname given to him by fellow pilots, by men and women who have spent their lives in cockpits and understand what true mastery looks like. The pilot's pilot. 3 words that encapsulate a lifetime of excellence, of pushing boundaries, of refusing to accept limits imposed by fear or convention or common sense. Late 1990s. The grounding of Bob Hoover. After nearly 60 years of flying, after surviving combat and captivity and test flights that killed other pilots, after performing at air shows for audiences around the world, Bob Hoover faces his final adversary. Not an enemy fighter or mechanical failure, but bureaucracy. In 1992, an FAA inspector witnesses one of Hoover's performances and becomes concerned about his age-related flying abilities. What follows is a years-long battle as the FAA attempts to revoke his medical certificate, effectively grounding him, despite Hoover's insistence that his skills remain intact. Close up, Hoover in a medical examination, performing tests designed to assess cognitive function and reaction time, the indignity of having to prove himself after decades of demonstrated excellence. The tests show him capable, competent, but the bureaucratic machinery grinds on regardless. The aviation community rallies around him. Fellow pilots, airshow organizations, aviation magazines, all protest the FAA's actions, arguing that Hoover remains safer in a cockpit at 70-something than most pilots half his age. But the regulations are clear. Age and medical certification requirements apply to everyone, even legends. In 1999, at age 77, Bob Hoover performs his final airshow routine. It is as precise and breathtaking as ever, a capstone to 50 years of public performance, but tinged with sadness. The knowledge that this is the end, that the thing that has defined his life since childhood is being taken from him not by inability but by regulation. Aerial perspective. Hoover's final landing, the wheels touching down for the last time in front of an audience, the props slowing to a stop, the end of an era marked not by crash or failure but by the simple passage of time and the rules that govern all pilots eventually. Tracking shot. Hoover climbing out of the cockpit, removing his helmet, accepting the applause of thousands who know they have just witnessed something they will never see again. The final performance of perhaps the greatest demonstration pilot who ever lived. Retirement is difficult for men who have defined themselves through action. Hoover remains involved in aviation through speaking engagements, appearances at air shows as a guest rather than performer, consultation on aviation safety and training. But it is not the same as flying, not the same as feeling the controls respond to your hands, the aircraft becoming an extension of your will. Friends and family report that he handles it with grace, accepting what cannot be changed, focusing on what remains rather than what is lost. But there is also a visible sadness, a dimming of that fire that burned so bright for so long. Over-the-shoulder view. An elderly Hoover watching younger pilots perform at air shows, his eyes tracking the aircraft with the same intensity, his hands unconsciously moving as if on imaginary controls, living the flight through them because he can no longer live it himself. In 2014, at age 92, Hoover receives a special birthday present. Permission to fly once more, a final flight in a P-51 Mustang with a qualified pilot accompanying him. A gift from friends who understand that asking him to live without flying is like asking a fish to live without water. Close up. Hoover's face during this final flight, tears streaming down weathered cheeks, the joy and sorrow mixed together, the bittersweet understanding that this is truly the end, the last time he will experience the thing he loves most. On October 25, 2016, at age 94, Robert Anderson Bob Hoover dies peacefully, surrounded by family, his remarkable life finally coming to an end. The news spreads through the aviation community like wildfire. Tributes pour in from around the world, from test pilots and combat veterans, from air show performers and aviation enthusiasts, from people who met him once at an air show and never forgot the gracious legend who signed their program and shared his story. Chuck Yeager, his friend since those early test pilot days, releases a statement, "Bob Hoover is the greatest pilot I ever knew. Coming from the man who broke the sound barrier, who flew combat in 2 wars, who tested hundreds of experimental aircraft, this is perhaps the ultimate epitaph." Present day. Air show somewhere in America. A young pilot stands beside an aircraft, preparing for a performance, running through mental checklists and procedures. On the nose of her aircraft is a small inscription, "In memory of Bob Hoover, the pilot's pilot." She never met him. He died before she even started flight training. But his influence is everywhere in how she approaches flying, in the emphasis on precision and smoothness, in the understanding that true mastery comes from thousands of hours of deliberate practice, in the belief that limits exist primarily to be exceeded by those with sufficient skill and courage. Close Up, a documentary playing on a museum screen showing grainy footage of Hoover's Stalag Luft I escape story, the stolen FW-190, the impossible flight to freedom. Visitors watch, captivated by this tale from another era, from a time when war created circumstances that demanded extraordinary responses. The story has been told and retold countless times now, in books and documentaries, in speeches at pilot training graduations, in articles analyzing the technical aspects of flying an unfamiliar aircraft without instruments. Each telling emphasizes different aspects, but all agree on the core truth. This was an act of remarkable courage and skill, a moment when desperation and ability converged to create something extraordinary. Historians studying the escape have documented its details. The April 20th date, the riot at Stalag Luft I, the 3 escapees and their subsequent fates, the abandoned airfield with its damaged aircraft, the German mechanic who helped start the engine, the flight across enemy territory, the belly landing in Holland. Every verifiable fact has been checked and confirmed. They have also documented what happened after. Jerome Ennis's recapture and subsequent liberation 11 days later when Soviet forces freed Stalag Luft I, George's disappearance into historical uncertainty, Hoover's return to Allied lines and immediate resumption of flight testing duties, as if 16 months of captivity were merely an interruption rather than a trauma. Over-the-shoulder view, researchers examining documents at the National Archives, pulling files on POW camps and escape attempts, finding Hoover's name in after-action reports and intelligence summaries, the bureaucratic documentation of extraordinary events reduced to typed paragraphs and official stamps. But the documents cannot capture the feeling of that moment, hands shaking from starvation and adrenaline, the roar of the BMW engine starting for the first time, the desperate sprint across the airfield, the stomach-dropping moment of takeoff in an unfamiliar aircraft, the hours of flight over enemy territory with fuel slowly draining and no certainty of survival. They cannot capture what it meant to refuse captivity so completely that you would rather die attempting escape than accept the passive safety of waiting. They cannot explain why some men, when caged, simply accept their circumstances while others spend every waking moment plotting freedom, no matter the cost. Aerial perspective. Modern fighter jets flying in formation, their pilots products of generations of accumulated knowledge and training, benefiting from the lessons learned by men like Hoover who pushed boundaries and survived to share what they learned. Every aspect of modern aviation bears the fingerprints of test pilots and innovators who risked their lives to advance the craft. Hoover's contributions extend beyond the dramatic escape. His work on the F-86 and F-100, his development of safety procedures and energy management techniques, his decades of teaching and mentoring younger pilots, all of it built the foundation on which contemporary aviation stands. But it is the escape story that captures imagination, that transcends technical achievement and becomes something mythic, something that speaks to fundamental human needs for freedom and agency and the refusal to accept defeat. Close Up. A father at an air museum telling his daughter the story, simplified for a child's understanding but retaining its essential truth. A pilot who stole an enemy airplane and flew it to freedom because waiting was not in his nature. The daughter's eyes go wide with wonder, already imagining herself in a cockpit, already understanding that the impossible is simply what hasn't been done yet. This is the true legacy, not just what Bob Hoover accomplished but what his accomplishments inspire in others. Every pilot who refuses to accept conventional wisdom about aircraft limitations, every test pilot who volunteers for dangerous missions to advance human knowledge, every person who looks at impossible odds and decides to try anyway, all of them are, in some sense, carrying forward the spirit that drove a starving prisoner to steal a German fighter rather than wait passively for liberation. Tracking shot through the National Museum of the United States Air Force. Exhibits dedicated to World War II aviators, to test pilots, to the men and women who pushed aviation from the Wright brothers' first flight to supersonic jets and beyond. Hoover's name appears in multiple places, his achievements documented alongside the giants of aviation history. But perhaps the most fitting memorial is simpler. On a clear day at any airport in America, you might see an older pilot pointing to the sky, explaining to a younger one the principles of energy management, smooth control inputs, the importance of truly understanding your aircraft rather than simply operating it. These lessons, passed down through generations, refined by experience and tragedy, are how aviation knowledge accumulates and improves. And woven through them, explicitly or implicitly, are the contributions of men like Bob Hoover who survived when they shouldn't have, who succeeded when failure seemed certain, who stole enemy fighters and flew them to freedom because the alternative was unacceptable. Over-the-shoulder view. Sunset over an airfield, aircraft tied down for the night, the perpetual cycle of flight and rest that has defined aviation since its beginning. Somewhere, a pilot is planning tomorrow's flight, checking weather and fuel and mechanical systems, preparing to do what humans have only been able to do for just over a century, leave the Earth behind and claim the sky as their domain. And if that pilot knows the story of Bob Hoover's escape from Stalag Luft I, knows about the stolen Focke-Wulf and the flight without instruments and the belly landing in Holland, perhaps it gives them courage to push a little harder, to accept a little more risk in pursuit of something extraordinary, to remember that the impossible is often just the difficult viewed from insufficient determination. On April 20, 1945, a starving prisoner stole a Nazi fighter and flew it to freedom across enemy territory with no maps, no instruments, no parachute, and no certainty of survival. It was crazy, it was impossible, and it worked. That is the story. That is the legend. And that is the lesson that echoes through aviation history, whispered in ready rooms and flight schools and air shows around the world. When circumstances demand the impossible, sometimes the only reasonable response is to attempt it anyway. Because Bob Hoover did. And if he could steal an enemy fighter and fly it to freedom with everything stacked against him, what impossible thing might you accomplish if you refuse to accept the limits others impose? The answer, like freedom itself, is yours to discover.